Hello and welcome to Aware on the Air, presented by members and friends of Aware, the anti-war, anti-racism effort, a local Champaign-Urbana peace group. I'm Carl Estabrook. We're recording this at midday on Tuesday, August 6th, in the studios of Urbana Public Television. Recording of earlier programs and links to the articles we refer to today can be found on the Facebook page for Aware of Champaign-Urbana, Illinois. Comments on this program are welcome. Email us at cgestabrook@gmail.com. Our program concentrates on the news of U.S. war-making, which is generally not reported, not by accident, in the U.S. media. War-making by the U.S. elite doesn't change unless we insist. The U.S. media, owned by large corporations, continue to tell us how terrible President Trump is, but that's a way of avoiding talking about how terrible U.S. government war-making is. In regard to killing people around the world, the Trump administration's policy seems little different from that of the Obama administration. President Obama inherited two shameful wars from the Bush administration in Afghanistan and Iraq. He increased the number to 8, attacking Libya, Pakistan, the Philippines, Somalia, Syria, and Yemen as well, and became the first U.S. president ever to be at war throughout 2 presidential terms. Not even Presidents Roosevelt in World War II, Wilson in World War I, or Lincoln in the Civil War did that. As Barack Obama said in 2012, after ordering drone assassinations of American citizens, including a teenager, and he did it purposely, quote, "Turns out I'm really good at killing people. Didn't know that was going to be a strong suit of mine," close quote. Barack Obama. Perhaps even more dangerously, he continued America's longest-standing foreign policy, attempting to prevent the integration of Eurasia for fear that that would retard the U.S. elite's economic exploitation of the rest of the world, by American war provocations against Russia and China, from Ukraine to the South China Sea. Trump, after criticizing Obama's war-making, has largely continued it. Since the end of World War II, the U.S. has killed more than 20 million people in wars, Korea, Vietnam, Latin America, the Mideast, and elsewhere, designed to destroy challenges to the economic hegemony the U.S. obtained as the only major country largely undamaged by World War II. In that war, Russia lost 27 million people in defeating Nazism. U.S. losses in World War II totaled about 500,000 people. That's why today international polls show that the U.S. is the most feared government in the world, not China, Russia, Iran, or Israel. The Trump administration is not the problem. U.S. war-making is. The rest of the world recognizes that the U.S. government remains what Martin Luther King called it long ago, the greatest purveyor of violence in the world today. With other peace groups around the world, we call upon our president and government to close all U.S. military bases on foreign soil, bring all U.S. troops and weapons home, and provide social supports, including free medical care, education, and a universal basic income, for all Americans who have been made poor by generations of our government's wars. Send your opinion to your representatives in Congress. Email addresses for Senator Dick Durbin, Senator Tammy Duckworth, and Representative Rodney Davis are on our Facebook page at Aware of Champaign-Urbana, Illinois. And this program, Aware on the Air, a local discussion of war news, is on Urbana Public Television Tuesdays at 10 p.m. and repeated, and on YouTube. The following letter to the editor appeared in the Champaign-Urbana News-Gazette this week. The author is not a member of Aware, but he's nevertheless been writing sensible things about U.S. wars for some time. The editors titled his letter, "Why Are We Still in Vietnam?" He writes, "If you have teenagers romping around your house, most of them have never known a day when the United States was not at war in Afghanistan. Think about that. This war was allegedly waged in response to the 9/11 attacks of 2001, even though 14 of the 19 terrorists were from Saudi Arabia. The initial target of that effort, Osama bin Laden, is long since dead. Recently, I read that 400 Illinois National Guard troops are being deployed to Afghanistan. This war has already consumed the lives of more than 2,300 U.S. service personnel and more than 1,700 U.S. contractors, mercenaries. It has resulted in more than 20,000 U.S. troop injuries and has cost over $1 trillion. Hundreds of thousands of Afghan citizens have been killed, wounded, or displaced. Their country is in rubble. Meanwhile, should a natural disaster occur here, Illinois National Guard service people will be depleted by their numbers sent to Afghanistan and other countries. We have normalized American wars of aggression around the world, despite polls that show that most Americans are sick of it. Yet the political class continues them, feeding at the trough of the war profiteers whom they serve. And so we're still in Vietnam. That's an important slip. And so we're still in Afghanistan, where empires go to die. From my point of view, we ought to hold to account all public figures who've been a party to this abomination, from Congress to the White House. And that letter to the editor of the News Gazette is signed by Joseph Bowers of Champaign. The following is from Axios, an American news and information website founded in 2016. The reporter writes, Lindsey Graham tries to talk Trump out of Afghanistan pullout. Senator Lindsey Graham, Republican of South Carolina, told me yesterday that he'd advised President Trump it would be a huge mistake, substantively and politically, to withdraw all U.S. military members from Afghanistan by the 2020 election. What he's saying, quote, when it comes to the election of 2020, I think it would be very easy for the president to defend leaving a counterterrorism force that was recommended by our military and intelligence community to protect the homeland after the debacle in Iraq. It would be hard in my view, and a high-risk strategy to reject such advice for political reasons, Graham added. As to debating Joe Biden, I think it would be easy for President Trump to remind people that, aren't you the guy, Biden, who said it was okay to leave Iraq, that led to the rise of ISIS? It's nonsense, of course, but that's the notion. If he does the same thing that Obama-Biden did, then he's lost that difference, and he owns this. It's a high-risk strategy. So Lindsey Graham says about President Trump. Why it matters. All the foreign policy hawks in the Republican Party, Graham is among a tiny group that has maintained close relations with Trump. The president doesn't always take Graham's advice, but he'll always take his call, and he'll always hear him out, aides say. Behind the scenes, Trump tells advisors that withdrawing from Afghanistan is one of the most important promises he made to voters. He badly wanted to withdraw in the earliest months of his presidency. But in the summer of 2017, he went against his instincts and let his generals persuade him to recommit to Afghanistan. In recent months, he's grown increasingly impatient behind the scenes and has demanded a quick path to withdrawal from the endless wars, according to people who've talked to the president. Some advisors have sought to appeal to Trump's contempt for President Obama as a strategy to keep him engaged in Afghanistan. Quote, don't be like Obama in Iraq. Don't leave a vacuum that Islamic terrorists will exploit, one advisor said he told the president. The bottom line, it's unclear whether any of these pitches have moved the president. And we might add that for all his bluster, President Trump is perhaps the weakest American president since Calvin Coolidge, so his decisions on these matters may not mean too much. Paul Craig Roberts writes, it's unfortunate that Tulsi Gabbard succumbed to the Israel lobby. The forces of the empire saw it as a sign of weakness and have set about destroying her. Gabbard is the only anti-war presidential candidate that the Democrats have, and she voted for House Resolution 246 against the boycott, divestment, and sanctions movement against Israeli apartheid. The ruling elite see Gabbard as a threat, just as they saw Trump as a threat. A threat is an attractive political candidate who questions the empire's agenda. Trump questioned the hostility towards Russia, orchestrated by the military security complex. Gabbard questions the empire's wars in the Middle East. This is questioning that encroaches on the agendas of the military security complex and Israel lobby. If fear of Israel is what caused Gabbard to vote the AIPAC line, the Israel lobby line, on the bill forbidding criticism of Israel, she won't be able to stick to her line against Washington's aggression in the Middle East. Israel is behind that aggression as it serves Israeli interests. But the empire is taking no chances. The empire has sicked its prostitute battalion on her. Josh Rogan of the Washington Post, Joy Reid of MSNBC, MSDNC as a friend says, Wahat Ali from the New York Times and CNN, and of course the Twitter trolls paid to slander and misrepresent public figures that the empire targets. Google added its weight to the obfuscation of Gabbard. Gabbard, who in the second debate, so-called, between Democratic Party candidates for the Democratic presidential nomination, took down the despicable Kamala Harris with ease, was promptly labeled an Assad apologist and a conspiracist with Russia to put herself as a Putin agent in the White House. You can't make this stuff up. Oh, they did make it up, of course. Wars in the Middle East against Israel's enemies and preparation for major wars against Iran, Russia, and China are the bread and butter for the powerful U.S. military security complex lobby. All that is important to the military security complex is their profits, not whether they get all of us killed. In other words, their propaganda about protecting America is a lie. They endanger us all in order to have enemies, in order to justify their massive budget and power. Those of us who actually know, such as myself, writes Paul Craig Roberts, and Stephen Cohen, have been warning for years that the orchestrated hostility against Russia is producing a far more dangerous Cold War than the original one. Indeed, beginning with the criminal George W. Bush regime, the arms control treaties achieved at great political expense by U.S. and Soviet leaders have been abandoned by Washington. The latest treaty to be discarded by Washington in service to the military security lobby is the Intermediate Range Nuclear Forces Treaty, INF, negotiated by President Ronald Reagan and Soviet leader Mikhail Gorbachev. This treaty banned missiles that Washington could place in Europe on Russia's border with which to attack Russia with little or no reaction time, and Russian missiles that could be used to attack Washington's NATO puppet states in Europe and the UK. The treaty resulted in the elimination of 2,692 missiles and a decade of verification inspections that satisfied both parties to the agreement, Russia and the United States. But suddenly Washington has pulled out of the treaty. The main purpose of pulling out of the treaty is to enable the military security complex in Washington to develop and produce new missiles at the taxpayers' expense, but Washington also sees a military advantage in withdrawing from the INF treaty. Washington, of course, blames the U.S. withdrawal on Russia, just as Washington blames every country that Washington intends to attack. But it's completely obvious, even to a moron, that Russia has no interest whatsoever in abandoning the treaty. Russian intermediate-range missiles cannot reach the United States. Russia has no reason to attack Europe, which has no military forces of any consequence. It is the American nuclear missiles on European soil that are the problem. Washington, however, does gain by tearing up the INF treaty. At Europe's risk, not America's, Washington's intermediate-range nuclear missiles stationed in Europe on Russia's borders permit a preemptive nuclear attack on Russia. Because of proximity, the warning time is only a couple of minutes. Washington's crazed war planners believe that so much of the Russian retaliatory capacity could be destroyed that Russia would surrender rather than retaliate with diminished forces and risk a second attack. Putin stresses this danger, as does the Russian military. U.S. missiles on Russia's border puts the world on a hair trigger. Aside from the fact that a nuclear attack on Russia is the likely intent of the criminal neoconservatives, nuclear warning systems are notorious for false alarms. During Cold War I, both sides worked to build trust. But since the criminal Clinton regime, Washington has worked to destroy all trust between the two dominant nuclear powers. All that is required to obliterate life on Earth, thanks entirely to the crazed fools in Washington, is one false alarm received by the Russians. Unlike past false alarms, next time the Russians will have no choice but to believe it. Intermediate-range nuclear missiles leave no time for a phone call between Putin and Trump. The Russian leader, who has suffered hundreds of diplomatic insults, demonization of his person and his country, illegal sanctions, endless false accusations, and endless threats, cannot assume that the warning is false. The idiots in Washington and the prostitutes have programmed the end of the world. When the alarm goes off, the Russian leader has no choice but to push the button. Any remaining doubt in the Russian government of Washington's hostile intentions towards Russia has been dispelled by Trump's national security advisor, the neocon warmonger John Bolton. Bolton recently announced that the last remaining arms control agreement, START, will not be renewed by Washington in 2021. Thus, the trust built between the nuclear powers that began with President John F. Kennedy and reached its greatest success with Reagan and Gorbachev has been erased. It would be lucky if the world survives the destruction of trust between the two major nuclear powers. The American government in Washington has been made so utterly stupid by its arrogant hubris that it has no comprehension of the dangerous situation that it and it alone has created. We are all at risk every minute of our lives because of the power of which President Eisenhower warned us more than half a century ago, to no avail, of the U.S. military security complex, an organized, powerful force determined and able to destroy any American president who would threaten their budget and power by making peace. Donald Trump is a strong personality, but he has been cowed by the Israel lobby and the military security complex. As reigning president, Trump sat there twittering while an attack orchestrated by the military security complex and the Democratic Party, with 100% cooperation from the American media, tried to portray him as a Russian agent as grounds for his impeachment. A strong personality in what is allegedly the most powerful office in the world, who allows his entire first term to be wasted by his opponents in an attempt to frame him and drive him from office, is all we need to know about the likely fate of Tulsi Gabbard. That's Paul Craig Roberts talking about the situation of the Chief Executive of the United States. You are listening to Aware on the Air, where we try to talk about the war news of the United States, which is programmatically ignored by the American media. This next piece, page 4, is from Gary Brecker. It's entitled Tanker Games. One of the worst things you can do trying to make sense of the international news is to assume there's some sanity behind it. Just try looking back at the last century. How much of that made any sense? That multi-trillion-dollar pantomime pantomime between NATO and the Warsaw Pact that ended in a, quote, a sea of rusting tanks, he's referring to the Cold War, there was never any sense to it. The logic of Vietnam, let's invade Southeast Asia because we promised we wouldn't invade Cuba, it was like one of Baldric's cunning plans from Blackadder. If you don't know Blackadder and Baldric, you have my sympathy. It's one of the better political shows on recent television. There's no sense to most of what happens. Even if lizard people rule the world, those lizard people are idiots. What there is pressure, built up over decades, old grudges that never stop swelling like abscess molars, pushing middle management into doing things they know are stupid and disastrous. The dueling oil tanker seizures over the past month in the Persian Gulf are a ludicrous, dirty-ass, funny example. Oh, they may end up in mass killing, but they're still a joke. You need an iron stomach and a titanium sense of humor in this business. Let's go back to July 4th, 2019, our nation's birthday, etc., and also the day 30 British Royal Marines choppered out of Gibraltar and landed on the deck of an Iranian-registered oil tanker. Gibraltar's a bit of a joke in itself. Carry on Victoria with a very motley crew of locals, almost none of them actually British, making a bundle and playing in the border with Spain. Then there's that big rock, Gibraltar, which stands for something or other. Don't tread on me and basalt. The New York Times took this wholly artificial enclave seriously, headlining its story, Gibraltar seizes Syria-bound tanker thought to be carrying Iranian oil. Close quote. It's a silly headline. Gibraltar didn't seize anything. London sent 30 Marines to grab the tanker, where they forced an expat crew of hard-working merchant seamen to kneel on the hot deck, offending the Indian captain's sensibilities, since he never had any intention of resisting this platoon of steroid maniacs screaming at his crew in Jason Statham. I'm talking about the actor, the British actor in Hobbs and Shaw. These steroid maniacs, as he says, the Royal Marines, screaming at the expat crew in Jason Statham accents. Gibraltar's only contribution was to smile and wave the Marines through customs, shake a few Union Jacks, nobody more patriotic than a Gibraltar, as long as the duty-free money keeps coming, and cheer on the airborne assault. Reuters, the news agency, was shameless enough to call the tanker grab a, quote, daring landing in darkness, as if 30 heavily armed professional amphibious soldiers trying to land on the flat deck of a civilian tanker was the Battle of Trafalgar all over again. Yes, brings tears to the eye of every Brexit-voting dotard on the wall, on the rock, Gibraltar. Haven't seen such courage since the U.S. forces took on that fearsome enemy of freedom, the dozen-strong army of Grenada. So the crew knelt on the hot metal decks, these screaming maniacs pacing around them, while the ship was dragged into Gibraltar Harbor. It's still there. An obedient Gibraltar court extended the crew's forced stay for 30 days. In all this wooden sword posturing, you might be tempted to ask, why? And what's perhaps the better question, who? Why would Gibraltar, grab an Iranian-registered tanker, even if it was bringing crude to Syria? The tanker grab was so weird, so damn dumb, that even the British Foreign Ministry, usually a reliable U.S. lapdog, couldn't hide its desire to find the nearest rubbish bin and puke into it. As the Guardian newspaper said, the morning after a group of 30 Royal Marines helped seize the Iranian-flagged Grace 1 in Gibraltar, tired Foreign Service officials did not look exactly jubilant. Close quote. Why would they? There's constant British shipping in the Persian Gulf, and even a garden slug could have figured out there were going to be tit-for-tat seizures by Iran. Besides, the whole legal justification for taking the tanker in the first place was a little vague, let's say. Continuing with the Guardian newspaper account, quote, there were some oddities to the British decision. Few previous shipments of oil to Syria have been impounded. The Spanish claim that the British acted under the instruction of the Americans. The Trump administration is trying to freeze all Iranian oil exports as part of its policy of maximum economic sanctions designed to force the Iranians to reopen talks on the nuclear deal signed in 2015. But Britain opposes that U.S. policy, arguing that it's counterproductive and only likely to strengthen the hands of hardliners in Tehran. Carl Bildt, the former Swedish Prime Minister and co-chair of the European Council on Foreign Relations, pinpointed the ambiguities of the British action in Gibraltar. Quote, the legality of the UK seizure of a tanker heading for Syria with oil from Iran intrigues me. One refers to EU sanctions against Syria, but Iran is not a member of the EU, and the EU as a principle doesn't impose its sanctions on others. That's what the U.S. does. Close quote. This is Swedish for, you groveling idiots. The key phrase here is, that's what the U.S. does. Gibraltar didn't do this. London did it only the way Jeeves would follow one of Bertie's more idiotic dicta. If you don't recognize the reference to P.G. Wodehouse, Jeeves in Worcester, I recommend you do. It's wonderful stuff. Washington did this. And to explain that decision, we must enter the realm of sheer madness. Not fun Van Gogh madness either, but a dull-witted, entropic, brainless madness, like a boulder rolling down a hill. The U.S. elite has a hate crush on Iran that goes back decades, makes no sense, and doesn't seem to feel any need to explain itself. The only rational aspect of this blood hate is not a very flattering one for the American power centers. Iran keeps kicking their ass. 1979, an Islamist coup overthrows the Shah, America's key Mideast ally. 1980, with U.S. encouragement, Iraq invades Iran, and after a long bloody war, loses. 1982, Hezbollah, Iran's closest ally, kills 242 U.S. Marines stupidly sent to Beirut by Reagan to support the Israeli invasion. Mid-1980s, a sustained campaign coordinated by Iranian, Syrian, and Hezbollah intelligence agencies penetrates the Beirut CIA station, kidnaps, tortures, and kills the station chief, and destroys a meeting of all-important CIA personnel with a VBIED, that is a car bomb. 2011 to the present, Iran, the SAA, the Syrian army, Hezbollah, and Iraqi Shia forces, with Russian help, win the Syrian civil war outright, making America's very expensive mercenaries look ridiculous. 2015 to the present, a Saudi-led coalition sends all its expensive American weaponry, running into the hundreds of billions, into northwest Yemen to destroy a dirt-poor Shia insurgency. The expensive weapons simply fail. The coalition infantry bugs out, and the Saudis are now hiring any mercenary they can find on the market to keep Yemeni Shia from invading Saudi's southwestern provinces. Iran and its allies, clients, partners, and distant cousins have won consistently against America and its pawns. This has led to rage in the suburbs of D.C., but something much more elemental in America's lovable little buddies, Saudi, the UAE, and Israel: pure terror. As I said before, the prospective Iran versus Saudi war that fools like to talk about would be completely one-sided. Iranian missiles would destroy the incredibly fragile infrastructure of the peninsula, the Arabian Peninsula. American planes and cruise missiles would inflict terrible suffering on the Iranian heartland, and from that point it would be a stalemate, except that eventually, under a rain of surface-to-surface missiles, the Arabian Peninsula would become uninhabitable. When you get a situation like this, when the war you want just isn't feasible, you start to get pantomimes set far away from the real site of conflict. In a sense, that's what Vietnam was. Cuba in a different time zone. And that's what this act of piracy, Iran's term, in the waters off Trafalgar actually means. A long-distance shadow play imitating a Persian Gulf War that can't be fought. And just as predictably as yellow jackets used to sting me when I'd insist on poking pyracantha twigs into their nest by the mailbox, retaliation by Iran followed. He's referring to what are called firethorn shrubs in the Mideast. On July 19, 2 weeks after the 4th of July Gibraltar tanker grab, Iranian small boats took 2 tankers captive near the Gulf of Hormuz, one British and one Liberian. Ship registry doesn't mean much. Liberian ships aren't crewed or owned for the most part by Liberians. It's a tax dodge. And the Liberian ship seized, the Mesdar, is in fact British owned. You have to wonder how the crews of all those hundreds of tankers felt approaching the Strait of Hormuz between July 4th and July 19th. Quote, are we going to be the symbolic victim here? Anybody see any fast, small boats coming up? Not that the crews were in much danger. Iran can play very, very rough when necessary, but they don't kill in an undisciplined way. So after boarding the Liberian tanker and making a point of stomping over its decks, they let it go. They kept the British-registered one. This is a very symbol-heavy game, and the flag you fly, even if it has nothing to do with the ethnic composition of your crew, makes a big difference. The British tanker was supposedly crewed by, quote, Indian, Russian, Latvian, and Filipino sailors. But tit for bloody tat is how you play it, and as long as there's an Iranian flag tanker rusting off Gibraltar, this British flag tanker will bubble and boil in the summer heat of Hormuz. Jeremy Hunt, the British Foreign Secretary, made the expected woofing noises. Quote, we are absolutely clear that if the situation is not resolved quickly, there will be serious consequences. Close quote. Then he got to the real point. Quote, we're not looking at military options. We're looking at a diplomatic way to resolve the situation, but we are very clear that it must be resolved. Close quote. That's because, and I don't know how many times I have to repeat this, there are no military solutions. Surface vessels are floating coffins, targets for every imaginable weapon. Cruise missiles, mines, ground-launched anti-ship missiles, and even civilian fishing vessels that suddenly peel back the tarp to show the weaponry. Millennium Challenge 2002 proved that 17 years ago. That was war games in the Gulf 17 years ago that showed how the American notion of control of the sea power simply wouldn't work. And the point that needs to be heard loud and clear now is that every single shift in the technology of naval warfare has accelerated the lessons of Van Riper's humiliation of the bloated, deluded USN. Van Riper was the American admiral who won those war games by showing that the American notion of control of the sea was fake. There may come a day when Moore's Law doesn't operate any longer, but that day is far off. Moore's Law is the principle that the speed and capability of computers can be expected to double every 2 years. As long as Moore's Law works, it works in favor of small, cheap weapons like drones, missiles, and guided mines, and works violently against the huge, indefensible surface vessels the U.S. is invested in. These vessels are not only huge, but very fragile. A few drones dropping incendiaries on a carrier deck is a nightmare, especially if there are planes already on deck. And by now, drones are a feature of even the most flat-broke irregular armies. Iran has had 2 decades to plot and replot every Google Maps square meter of the Persian Gulf. Instead of playing expensive fighter plane games with the U.S., Iran has focused on developing a formidable stable of surface-to-surface missiles, now dug in all along the northern shore of the Gulf. And that brings us back to Gibraltar. Why grab an Iranian tanker there? Because you can do so without being blown out of the water. And why let Iran grab 2 of your tankers in the Gulf, then do nothing but make silly blustering noises? Because your surface fleet would vanish from the Gulf, go straight to the bottom, and all you could do was punish Iran with strikes against civilian infrastructure. Along the way, your client states in the Gulf, from Kuwait to Fujairah, would become collateral damage. That's a lot for Britain to risk, just to indulge the obsessions of the U.S. security apparatus, which is frankly insane on the topic of Iran. So we're looking at bloodless so far ballet, a naval minuet, a suite of gestures and counter-gestures. That's a relatively harmless form of stupidity. But as I said at the beginning of this newsletter, it's a huge mistake to think that any sane mind or collection of minds is in control of this. Many a minuet has turned into a bloody massacre in the past, and this one could go from slapstick to horror in a matter of minutes. That's Paul Craig Roberts on the tanker seizures in the Persian Gulf. You have been listening to Aware on the Air, produced and directed by Jason Liggett and Andrew Scholarly. Thanks to whom also this program and others like it will be available on YouTube and archive.org. Comments on this program are welcome. Email us at cgestabrook@gmail.com. We rely on a researcher, Jeff Nicholson, whose blog, Digital Citizen, we recommend highly. We steal from it regularly. There's a link to it on our Facebook page, along with his detailed notes to this program. We'll conclude tonight with videos supplied by Jeff on how Israel treats Palestinians, U.S. culpability in that murderous apartheid state, and the anti-free speech handiwork of the lobby. And I refer specifically to the anti-BDS bill that the House just passed. Finally, Aware honors those who reveal the crimes of the U.S. government, which the rest of the world knows about, but Americans don't. Assange, Manning, Snowden, and the others who are truth-tellers persecuted by the U.S. government, and particularly our liberal Democratic Senator Durbin, a shill for the Russiagate propaganda and unconstitutional attacks on the free press, notably in the case of WikiLeaks. Now, this is Carl Estabrook for the members and friends of AWARE, the anti-war, anti-racism effort of Champaign-Urbana, saying in the words of the late newsman Edward R. Murrow, good night and good luck.